Hi everyone, my presentation is on Jeffrey Dahmer, The Making of a Serial Killer, and it's by me, Carly Thomas. Okay, so why did I choose to research about Dahmer? I'm interested in the psyche of serial killers and how they become, such heinous people. And I've really enjoyed watching the miniseries on Netflix. I found it a great interest in wanting to learn more about him and where things went wrong in his childhood. Dahmer in his early years. He was born on May 21st, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Lionel Dahmer and Joyce Dahmer. Her maiden name was Flint. A little side note, he's a Gemini. So people should have known right off the bat that he was not to be messed with. But anyway, he was an energetic and happy child until the age of 4. After his traumatic recovery from a surgery correcting a double hernia, it seemed to have an effect and change on him drastically. Uh, from the studies that I've read, they have said that, he was happy and a cool and interested child. And then after his surgery, he seemed to be a little more withdrawn and just, not the same kid that he used to be. From a young age, he was fascinated with animal bones and he researched how to clean and preserve them. And he would collect the skulls of small animals and large insects and then proceed to preserve them in formaldehyde. As Dahmer got into his teen years, he became more disengaged, very tense and friendless. He was very introverted and just to himself, a lot of self-isolating. He didn't feel that connection with his peers the way that most, teens would. So that definitely, I believe, played a part in how he was as an adult. His compulsions for necrophilia and murder began around the age of 14, but his parents' difficult marriage and awful divorce may have been the turning point for when these thoughts became actions. He started drinking at the age of 14, and by the time he had his first victim, his alcoholism was already out of control. Like I said before, he already had these compulsions, but of course, him not being able to go to his parents to talk about, those compulsions, he was probably a little embarrassed, and like anybody would be, of course, if you were feeling that kind of way, but his parents' divorce and, the constant arguing, I'm sure he didn't even feel comfortable enough to speak about those things. During his young adult years, Dahmer went to Ohio State University, but shortly after his first term, he dropped out. He wasn't doing well. And afterwards, his father insisted that he enlist in the Army because he was just kind of over his bull. So this was around December of 1978. While in the Army, he was posted to Germany not shortly after. In 1981, he was discharged from the Army for his persistent drinking problem. And German authorities later investigated possible connections between Dahmer and the murders that took place during that time while he was serving, but it was not believed that he took any victims while being in the armed forces. There was no evidence to help convey that he was, doing any of the killings during that time. And his young adult years continued. After being discharged, he returned home to Ohio and was arrested later that year for disorderly conduct. Due to frustration with Dahmer, his father sent him to live with his grandmother in Wisconsin. His alcoholism continued, and he would later be arrested for indecent exposure and then being arrested again because 2 young boys accused him of masturbating in front of them. From that, he was given a 1-year probationary sentence. Now I wanted to give an overview of the killings. So overall, Dahmer murdered 17 men between the years of 1978 and 1991. His victims were usually marginalized or ignored individuals so that their disappearances would be less noticeable and he wouldn't get caught. As you can see from the pictures, on the left, most of his victims were black or brown gay men. or I think 2 of his victims were boys. So the rest were older men, but 2 of them were minors at the time of their killing. He would lure them into his house with promises of sex or money, and then he would strangle them to death. He would then engage in sexual acts with their dead bodies. He would keep body parts and Polaroid pictures as souvenirs. His popular nicknames were the Milwaukee Cannibal and the Milwaukee Monster to reflect his heinous crimes. Now to get into the first 4 victims. Of course, I'm not going to explain all of the 17 victims because that would take a lot of time. But just to give a little more insight to the patterns that he had and, behaviors that he developed as he continued to kill people. His first murder occurred in June of 1978 when he picked up an 18-year-old hitchhiker, which is Stephen Hicks, and took him to his parents' home. He proceeded to get Hicks drunk, and then when Hicks tried to leave, Dahmer didn't want him to go, and he killed him by striking him in the back of the head with a barbell and strangling him. Just to put in there, watching that on Netflix in the series was terrifying, to say the least, because it was very abrupt. He was just really not wanting him to leave, and you could see how the behavior became something that he couldn't control. Not to, of course, justify his actions, but to just see how it took over him, and he was just like, no, like, you're not leaving. He later dismembered Hicks and put his body parts in a plastic bag and buried them behind his parents' home. He later dug up the corpse, crushed the bones with a sledgehammer, and then scattered them in a wooden ravine. His next victim wasn't until 1987, which was about a decade later, and his name was also Stephen, but it was Stephen Tuomi, and they checked into a hotel room, drank, and Dahmer woke up to find Tuomi dead. Dahmer doesn't recount any of the events from the night, and later told the police that he didn't intend to kill Tuomi, just drug him. He killed 2 more victims at his grandmother's before she kicked him out due to his excessive drinking and bringing in young men into the house and the foul smells coming from her basement, which she was unaware of the killings at the time based off of her statement, but she didn't like the patterns that he had while at her house. When he dismembered the body of Tuomi, it was also said that he masturbated on the corpse before disposing of it, and he kept the head wrapped into a blanket for weeks after the murder. His obsession with killing went into a full swing, and he didn't even try to stop the compulsions after that. That was also another scene in Netflix of him, like, kissing a severed head, and that was terrifying as well to watch, but yeah. So for the last 13 victims, over the course of 2 years, Dahmer would go on to kill 12 more people, making his total victim count 17. His first victim was Raymond Smith, who was a prostitute, and they were lured into Dahmer's apartment for sex. They were then given a laced drink, which had sleeping pills in it, and then he was strangled. Photos of his body were taken before being dismembered as well. Dahmer began a pattern/ritual with his killings and experimented with chemicals as means for disposal. He often ate the flesh of his victims and attempted lobotomies. And during these lobotomies, he would usually pour some sort of acid into the person's brain so that they were in a submissive state and would do whatever he wanted them to do. On May 27th, 1991, his neighbor Sandra Smith called the police to report that an Asian boy was running naked in the street. When police arrived, the boy was incoherent, and they took the word of Dahmer when he said that the boy was his 19-year-old lover. Of course, this is 1991, and the relationship that white men, regularly have with the police, whether they know them or not, he's living in a largely poor black neighborhood, and his word goes. There was no question about it. The police escorted them back into Dahmer's home and did a quick scan, quote-unquote scan, of the apartment and found nothing suspicious. Later, Dahmer injected hydrochloric acid into the boy's brain, which killed him. It was also said in the report that if they had did just 2 more seconds of scanning, they would have found the victim right before this young boy. It was his 12th victim that they would have found in his room. They would have found body parts and pictures and things like that. Dahmer killed 4 more men before being arrested on July 22nd, 1991. And on November 28th, 1994, in Portage, Wisconsin, Dahmer was killed by a fellow prison inmate, Christopher Scarver, at Columbia Correctional Institution. For the analysis, I would connect Dahmer's upbringing and actions with the theory of Albert Bandura and observational learning. Observational learning models as sources or vicarious reinforcement and vicarious punishment. The processes include attention, retention, motor reproduction, and motivation. Dahmer was taught taxidermy as a child by his father, who was a chemist and saw that Dahmer piqued interest in dead animals. So they would bond over learning and teaching of how bones and flesh decompose and what chemicals would help preserve those types of remains. Because children model what they see growing up, it was not out of the ordinary that Dahmer would grow up to do this to innocent individuals. Dahmer and his younger brother grew up in an aggressive household with lots of arguing and abuse. Due to this, he was not taught how to handle problems and cope with his emotions or compulsions. It was also mentioned that Dahmer had changed after undergoing surgery for his double hernia at 3 years old, as stated earlier in the presentation. After the surgery, he became silent and fearful. It was also discovered that his mother suffered from depression and was reportedly a hypochondriac and attempted to overdose on anxiety medication. Dahmer recalled doubting the solidity of his family. I also feel that he embodies parts of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. His most basic needs of physical survival are met, which of like food, clothes, warmth, sleep, and health. But this is all that is met. His emotional safety was definitely not met within his household and at school. With the lack of friends and the constant arguing at home, this would be a factor for his lack of safety, which in turn wouldn't allow him to feel accepted in the third tier of the love and belonging of, being in a tribe. I feel that this led to his self-isolation and introvertedness, which would cause him to grow up and seek that attention from other people. And when they did not want it, his compulsions would take over and he would essentially kill them. And these are just a list of my references. I hope that you all enjoyed my presentation. I really enjoyed making this.